Hey folks, if you're looking for an in-depth review, you're in the right place. Especially if you were curious about Blackgate Studios' recently released point-and-click adventure, Delirium. Though, to call it a point-and-click might be a bit of a misnomer since it has legitimately zero mouse compatibility, and it requires a controller to play, which begs the question, did this hamper the game enough to make it a maddening experience, or did I wind up having a crazy bit of fun? I'm your host Arlyeon, let's find out together. Delirium follows Lola, a punky-looking girl who just wanted to catch a few Z's, but has not only found herself rudely awakened, but also the victim of a far greater crime. Someone has stolen her chubby cat, Lagzagna. It's written like this throughout the entire game, so I'm not sure it's a typo, but it definitely feels bad to say, and I am almost positive, given it is a fat orange cat, that it's meant to be lasagna. Anyways, the important thing is that she must embark on an epic journey through her own house, which has been weirdly altered in the sense that pop culture references have intrusively begun to overwrite reality. I'm not kidding, by the way. Engaging with the game's story is figuratively and literally the equivalent of someone insistently nudging you in the ribs with their elbow, wiggling their eyebrows in an attempt to look meaningful, and then asking you if you caught that latest reference. And honestly, I think it could have been charming. There were certainly moments where I found myself briefly amused by the situations, and yet they tend to overstay their welcome, becoming a grating narrative thread that you're unable to really escape from. I mean, okay, so there's Lola's brother Danny and a foul-mouthed rabbit plushie as additional characters to chat with, but even those aren't exempt from falling into the trap of drawing situations out longer than necessary, frequently by iterating the threadbare plot as so far or relying on prolonged bits of boneheaded humor. Which, I should note, also means you'll wind up with an ample amount of time on your hands to really soak in the progressively jankier localization. While it's not the worst thing I've read, it was notable and seemed to increase in frequency the further into the game got, which, in a game that relies on written comedy, only serves to further undermine a large part of what it's trying to do. But wait, there's more, because perhaps the biggest failing to this game's plot was the simple fact that it doesn't have much of one. Despite all the banter and silly references, a good portion of the game can essentially be described as engaging with busy work so you can find a cat, with everything associated to how and why anything happened being essentially relegated to a brief scene crammed into the tail end of the game. A scene which essentially serves as a sequel hook while simultaneously hammering home that the crux of what you did during this particular chapter was ultimately irrelevant. As far as revelations go, this one sort of sucks, which means it now lands firmly on the mechanics to save this game, and I have one thing to say off the hop. The complete lack of keyboard and mouse controls does not feel good. And as far as the controller options go, Delirium is playable, but I'll be the first to admit that this style of game is probably not ideal for controller only, especially when it occasionally asks you to highlight extremely small objects. Fiddling around with the joysticks as I try to click on something is just such a crummy feeling. Thankfully, the game's at least gracious enough to give you a button that highlights every option that you can interact with based on whether you're trying to look at it, talk to it, or use it, so you're not blindly searching for tiny objects. I say this, but well, okay, as much as this thing does highlight things and should work, there's some flaws with the puzzle solving as well. See, while the game teaches you early on that you can highlight things, in order to figure out what you can potentially interact with and collect in order to solve puzzles, even with a precedent being set of being able to snag certain items freely, others will only be interactable if you follow a specific chain of events. And this gets a little bit insulting, really, since I'd effectively figured out what I needed for in a puzzle in a specific room, and then spent something like 30 minutes or so pacing around the house trying to grab it or stuff from other rooms and failing because I was being gated from proceeding because I hadn't looked at a picture. So the characters could comment on the fact that they already commented on and come to the conclusion that I'd already arrived at, that I needed to make this character look like the character that he looks like. That was a thing. That's not to say all the point and click elements are bad. Some of them do feel fairly organic and make sense, but they also don't feel great. In fact, the two segments I think Delirium did best were a pair of logic puzzles, which overall changed things up rather neatly. The first of which thoroughly stumped me for a while, and admittedly there are some elements of slowness for that first sequence, but it is a very good puzzle. The second one wasn't anywhere near as hard, but I still dug it all the same. And then the game ended. Yeah, I mean, yes, there was an optional collectible hunt to engage with, but honestly, having spent a day and change away from the game, so much of the experience is just fading away beyond a pervasive sense of irritation. Which means it's time to talk about the graphics, an element that is quite likely one of Delirium's strongest suits. Frankly, there is a decent amount of effort into making sure that Lola and the other characters have some fairly dynamic portraits during their conversation scenes, many of which do a decent job of mirroring the style of their source material. Also, for some unfathomable reason, the stuffed bunny occasionally looks like Dio. Admittedly, this can still feel a bit jarring, if only because of the art style clashes, but there's still something simultaneously charming about exploring these spaces. That said, what I can't fault on an aesthetic level is the music. On the whole, it's pretty decent, and the artist stabs at referential themes to help hammer home the more blatant references do feel surprisingly on point, and actually less in your face than the other elements. Like, unironically, things wind up being so blatant that they probably should have just shrugged and named one of the characters Dick Sanchez. Which, if it isn't abundantly clear yet, this game is, fittingly enough, in a bit of a pickle.
I'm Pickle Rick!
Yeah, I actually am fairly fond of point and clicks traditionally. I like the cerebral elements, and I've had the pleasure of playing a fair number that are accompanied by legitimately solid storytelling. I have essentially been spoiled for choice insofar as good titles in the genre, and I don't think Delirium measures up. In fact, based on how it felt to play the game and just how tedious, I'm not sure I'd recommend this to anyone. Any sort of charm I felt the game had gradually oozed away over the course of my playthrough, leaving me with an exasperated eagerness to see this particular chapter closed, even if the overall experience felt insubstantial. It's a game that will feel somewhat long at times and yet devoid of actual content. And it's for that reason that I ultimately rate this game a fail. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment. And if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews, interviews, and gaming content, hit the subscribe button and the bell. For the Discord savvy folks, there's a link to my community, the Crit Hit Cauldron, in the video description, and to my Patreon so you can support me and the other members of Crit Hit. Also to my Twitch if you want to see me get dunked on indie games live. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.